Okay, let's take a look at the Beauvoir analysis. This is the last time I'm going to do the video lecture in two separate parts, with the reading analysis first and then the overview after that. After this lecture, I'll just go ahead and do an overview lecture. I'm going to assume that you all will have become proficient in constructing your own section by section reading analyses, and you can use those as a way to sort of prepare for the video lecture. So maybe just read over those quickly. You'll have an idea, an overview of what the text was about generally, refresh your memory from the previous day, and then you can take a look at the video. I'll try to cut down the length of the videos as well a little bit, as much as possible. Let's start today again with a quick review of the section by section analysis of the text, and then we'll talk in a little bit more depth about Beauvoir's introduction to the second sex. The second sex, by the way, is a huge text, hundreds and hundreds of pages, written in the early 50s, I think maybe 1952 or somewhere around there. And Simone de Beauvoir is a French existentialist feminist writer. Let's take a look quickly at the reading analysis. I've said that I take the thesis to be something like: the fact of being or becoming a woman affects our lives, and in order to undermine gender oppression, women must become subjects to change the social ontology that is the basis of identity formation. When you identify your thesis, please remember that what the thesis is the overall claim that the author is trying to make. It's the conclusion of the argument that the author is given. Though it often comes early on, though not always, it often comes early on in the writing and is sometimes repeated in several different ways. This is the conclusion of the argument, and it's the claim that the author is trying to use the rest of the argument, the rest of the text, to convince the reader that this claim, the thesis, is right, or is good, or that we ought to agree with it, that we have reason to agree with it. You can think of it in this way, particularly in feminist writings. What is the author trying to do here? There's a lot of theory that is not as much about doing, but more about explaining. Feminist theory tends to be activist by nature. And when a feminist theorist writes a text, they're doing that from a place of activism, and they're trying to do something. They're trying to accomplish something. And what Beauvoir is trying to accomplish, at least in the introduction here to the second sex, is she's trying to get us to see that the social context within which one becomes a woman has a great impact on our lives, how we live our lives, what our freedoms are like, what our limitations are like, and what opportunities we have. She's arguing here that in order to undermine gender oppression, women have to acknowledge the fact that they are others in social relationships with men, and that we have to become subjects in order to change the social ontology that is at the basis of our identity formation. That is, when we formulate or we form who we are, part of who we are, a large part of who we are, is shaped by the binary gender system. And we have to change the way that that binary gender system, man and woman, operates in such a way that man is the subject, the center, and woman is the other, peripheral, inessential, contingent. Beauvoir has a lot of work that she does in the larger text. But in this text right here, she's trying to at least get us to acknowledge that there's something about what it is to be a woman that is not natural or essential, but that has to do with the way in which we are othered by men. So let's run down through each of these sections, and again, we'll go into this a little bit more deeply in the next part. So in the first section, Beauvoir argues that if femininity is in crisis, which was the talk of the day in the 50s, then every female is not necessarily a woman. There's no essential characteristic that makes someone a woman. Yet, to deny the eternal feminine is not to deny that women exist. Differences between two classes of people do in fact exist. She says, look around, right? You'll see there are men and there are women. But women have not been liberated by talk of equality or anti-essentialism. And again, we'll go into this more in the second part. I want to run down this fairly quickly. In the second section, Beauvoir says that if woman is not defined merely as female or eternally feminine, then she asks, what is woman? Though she says we would never ask, what is man? Man represents both the positive and the neutral on the human scale, and woman represents only the negative. Woman is always marked, always defined by limiting criteria, always subjective, never objective. And humanity is male, and woman is defined not as an autonomous being, but as a sexual being. She is defined relative to man, who is objective and absolute. Humanity is male, and woman is defined not as an autonomous being, but as a sexual being. She is defined in relation to man, who is objective and absolute, as incidental and inessential. She is defined as other. In section 3, Beauvoir argues that otherness is a fundamental category of human thought. All groups set themselves up as the one while setting up the other against itself. Yet the other is not an absolute concept, as it is manifest in its relations, since the one can become the other. Yet a reciprocity of otherness has not been recognized within the sex-gender binary, as women have remained other. This is likely fairly confusing, but I'll go into more detail on this in the next part. This third section has a lot of philosophical roots in the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, if you've heard of that at all. If anyone's read any Hegel or Marx, you might be. In section 4, Beauvoir argues that there have always been women, quote, by virtue of their anatomy and physiology. So the subordination of women is not a result of an historical event, and it is thus not contingent, but in some sense natural. So unlike other groups, women lack a means of organizing, and they have not formed a collective subject. That is, they haven't formed a solidaritous we in the same way that other groups have, including men, but also including other oppressed groups. So women have a close bond uniting them with their oppressors. Beauvoir says, woman, quote, is the other in a totality of which the two components are necessary to one another, end quote. So there's a very close and tight and difficult to break bond between men and women that keeps women from organizing in such a way that they can liberate themselves from systems of oppression. In section 5, Beauvoir argues that, like the master-slave dialectic, men need women. So in the same way that the master depends upon the slave, it's not simply that the slave depends upon the master, but actually the master needs the slave. In the same way, men need women. They rely upon them. They rely upon women to see them as subjects, as men. Yet women are not liberated from men by their dependence, since the need always works in favor of the oppressor, the master, and against the oppressed. Even when women's rights are legally or formally recognized, inequality and oppression remain in practice, since social practices regenerate and men have produced socio-historical practices. Recall Bartke's account of cultural domination. Women fail to embrace their subjectivity because they are comfortable in their role as other. In section 6, Beauvoir argues that essentialist rhetoric is a vicious circle. When a person is in an inferior position, the fact of their inferior position is used to prove that they are inferior. Women are inferior to men in that their situation limits their possibilities, but this does not mean that they are essentially, naturally inferior. Similarly, men place themselves into a collective wherein, by virtue of one's being a man, he can identify with the ideas of great thinkers as his own. Section 7. Refusing to position oneself as the subject requires self-denial and an internalization of inferiority. Many men will both affirm that women are men's equals, while simultaneously denying that they can be their equals. They cite their natural inferiority. Recall, again, Bartke's mystification, the naturalization of women's gender roles. For this reason, we should not put much trust in men's assistance in achieving equality. In Section 8, Beauvoir argues that the woman question is problematic because it's mired in conflicting and fallacious arguments. It is important for women to ask how the fact of being women will affect our lives. How have our opportunities been limited, and what is our fate? One achieves liberty only by transcending one's current position and expanding into other liberties while engaging in freely chosen projects. In Section 9, Beauvoir argues that women's existence is peculiar since she is free and autonomous, yet she assumes the position of the other, doomed to imminence. Woman's situation can be understood through the conflict between her aspirations toward transcendence on the one hand and the situation in which she is deemed inessential and her freedoms are blocked. Woman must be able to see the limitations placed on her in order to transcend them. You should have a clue that, as an existentialist, what Beauvoir was concerned with as existentialist is freedom, liberty. Beauvoir is concerned not with equality, but with freedom. Our capability as individual women to be able to self-actualize and make our own decisions and choices, and to transcend the situations within which we find ourselves. Okay, so de Beauvoir is trying to argue here that the fact of being a woman affects our lives. In order to undermine oppression, women must become subjects to change the social ontology that is at the basis of the way in which we form our identities. Ontology means the study of being, categories of being. What is it to be? What is it to be a woman? And the fact that being a woman is at the very basis of the way in which we form our identities, who we are, what kind of agency we exercise, to what degree we internalize oppression. We need to change our social ontology in order to undermine gender oppression. In the introduction to this text, Beauvoir asks an absolutely groundbreaking question that no one has asked before. Beauvoir asks, what is a woman? This question is groundbreaking because nobody ever asks this question about man. Nobody asks, what is man? We know what man is. Man has been discussed in every book of fiction, in every book of literature, in every philosophy text, in every legal policy, in the Constitution. We know what man is. Man is just what it is to be a human person. A woman must define herself as a woman. Men don't have to define themselves as men. They're just persons. For example, you might hear oftentimes what Marilyn Frye has called marked. Women are often marked in a particular way. That is, your dad might be a doctor or a lawyer or an astronaut, but if your mom is a doctor or a lawyer or an astronaut, it's more than likely said of her at one time or another that she is a female doctor or a female lawyer, or a female astronaut. Women have to define themselves as women, whereas men are just people. They're neutral. So humanity is essentially male, and humanity defines women as relative to men, as inferior to men. And as Beauvoir notes, there's a great deal of this throughout our cultural history. Just in philosophy, she notes that the history of philosophy is rife with male philosophers claiming that women are inferior to men, from Plato and Aristotle to St. Thomas, Aquinas, Augustine, and Kant. But not all females are women. Around the mid-20th century, when Beauvoir was writing this text, there was a lot of discussion about how femininity was in danger. If you picked up the magazines, there were worries that women were becoming less feminine. They were getting maybe part-time jobs or wearing trousers instead of skirts. So there was this discussion of how femininity was in danger. But as Beauvoir says, if femininity is in danger, then being a woman is not some essential feature of females. It's an arbitrary designation. Beauvoir gives us her most famous quote when she says, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. Only the intervention of someone else can establish any individual as other." So one is not born a woman. Becoming a woman is something that happens to you by someone else. Someone recognizes women as others and thus places them in that side of the binary gender dichotomy. Some feminists, liberal feminists, respond to this issue by claiming that there are two categories of human beings. There are men and there are women. And all people, both men and women, should be considered human. But women simply are not men. Beauvoir and others are going to have an issue with this kind of liberal approach that really seeks equality among humans and this notion that we're all the same. Because the fact is we're not all the same. This feminist approach that seeks to undermine oppression from the perspective of equality suppresses differences among men and women. Yet, in society, man is seen as neutral and positive, representing humanity and all of its infinite possibility and creativity and wonder. And woman is seen as negative, as other, as inessential. If we deny the conditions under which we become other, we cannot see the problem. This is what Beauvoir is getting at when she says we have to change our understanding of social ontology. If we don't look at our social ontology, at the way in which we understand our very being as women, then we can't see the problem because that's where the problem lies. The problem of women lies in the fact that we are made as other. We become other. We're not born already essentially naturally inferior, essentially naturally other. We become other by being othered. So other is a primordial category. And problems of gender and sexuality are at the basis. They are deeply embedded in our identity as persons, as selves. And the history of consciousness formation shows that there must be a boundaried self, that I can distinguish myself as different from you. This is recognition theory, particularly in Hegel. What is it to be a self and to recognize someone else as separate from me? I'm here, you're over there. I'm a self, you're an other. This duality, self and other, was not originally empirical. It did not attached to the division of the sexes. Historically, though, socially, socio-historically, men became essential and women became inessential. Men became selves and women became others. So this implies that the liberal approach of shifting resources so that we're all treated equally, that we all have equal access to resources, is not enough. Gender oppression is rooted in the very formation of our identities. When I am a self and I recognize someone else as other, yet that other does not recognize me as a self, and I constantly internalize the fact that I am other, I become other. I identify as other rather than as a subject. So even the most mediocre of males, Beauvoir says, believes himself to be a demigod compared with women. Men profit in many, many ways from the otherness and the alterity of women. Sympathetic men might admit that women are equal or ought to be treated equally to men, but at the same time, they cannot be equal to men because they can't serve in the same professions or they're not capable of the same depth of reason. So even the most sympathetic of men who on the one hand want to admit that women ought to be treated equally will turn around and have some kind of essentialist claim as to why women in fact aren't the same as men. They're not as strong, they're not as aggressive, they're not as rational, right? That there's something essential about women that makes them inferior. But what Beauvoir is trying to argue is that basically that's bullshit. That is a social becoming that has been put on women. One is not born a woman, one is not born other, but rather one becomes a woman. One is othered by men. Why, Beauvoir asks, do women remain submissive? We have been put into the role of other. Why do we remain there? Why do we accept that? Why do women accept an alien, submissive point of view? Why do women not dispute male sovereignty? She's going to claim that it's not due to inequality of number. We are not a minority. Unlike other oppressed groups, we actually have roughly the same population as males. Minority issues have historical events. There's a history prior to colonialism. There's a history prior to slavery. There's a history prior to the growth of the proletariat. There's not a history prior to women. The other, though, is cast as other by the subject. Women are cast as other by men. And submission, Beauvoir argues, comes from the fact that women haven't changed it. The social ontology of women must be changed. We have to dig all the way down to the core of our identity, the way that we understand ourselves as selves, and refuse to be seen as other. We have to embrace our subjectivity and refuse to internalize our otherness, which requires a great deal of awareness and attention to those social and cultural relationships and systems and networks that other and oppress women. So on Beauvoir's view, she thinks the liberal feminists have it wrong. There's nothing that equal resources can do to help us. Even if we had equal resources, we could still be oppressed because we would still be cast in the role of other. So she thinks women must do something. This is a kind of battle cry here. Women must do something. But many women are comfortable in their role as other. Declining to be in the appropriate social role means you take yourself away from power and privilege that comes along with that role. So refusing to stay in that feminine submissive role means that you take yourself away from the kind of economic and political power and resources that you're accustomed to. And this is why many women are comfortable in their role as other. Oh, that's what I want to do. I want to be a housewife. It makes me happy. This kind of thing. That may be true. It may make you happy. But Beauvoir's point is that women will never be autonomous subjects so long as they accept the role of otherness. On Beauvoir's view, we have to agitate. We have to agitate, and not merely symbolically. We have to agitate significantly in ways that will create change at the ontological level, at the level of our very being, at the level of our very subject formation. And our subject formation is how we see the world, how we perceive the world. How do we agitate without power? How do we agitate without resources? How do we agitate without solidarity? We could never really be separatists because we would need the resources of men. Women are different from other minorities. Women lack means of organizing, we lack solidarity, we lack community. We're not segregated. We can't be separatists. Contra the claims of the second wave radical feminists. Women have taken only what men have been willing to give us. And the bond uniting women to our oppressors is unique. The division of the sexes is a biological fact, according to Beauvoir, not an historical event. We will challenge this idea. Although it's interesting, although Beauvoir is challenging essentialism, be aware that what she's challenging here is gender essentialism. That there's something essential about being a woman, or there's something essential about being a man. That women are essentially weaker, irrational. That women are essentially weak, irrational, inessential. That men are essentially strong, rational human beings. She is challenging the fact that gender is real in that way. However, on Beauvoir's view, she does claim that the division of sexes is a biological fact, not a historical event. So she's leaving a kind of essentialism in place. That is, that there are two distinct categories of biological sex, male and female. So gender is masculine, feminine, or man and woman, whereas biological sex is understood to be maleness and femaleness. And on Beauvoir's view, she's not challenging the fact that maleness and femaleness is natural, essential, inherent. We'll challenge that view in future readings, though. Now, Beauvoir asks, do women really want liberation? Do we really want to be liberated? Do we really want to be subjects? Do we really want to be autonomous? Do we really want to be free? Do we really want to transcend the situations that we find ourselves in? If we do, Beauvoir says, women must give up their privileges. Women must become subjects. They must refuse to be cast as other. How is it that the world has always belonged to men and that things have begun to change only recently? Beauvoir says, look, these naturalist kind of accounts of what it is to be a woman exemplify a vicious circle. When an individual is kept in a situation of inferiority, he is in fact inferior, where is means to become. So to say that women are inferior is not to say that they are essentially inferior, though it is to say that they are in a they have become inferior through a situation of oppression. There's a tension between existential choice and transcendence and becoming inferior. Internalizing beliefs, saying something is inside me as a static identity, is different than having fewer possibilities, which is a condition of the environment I'm in. Beauvoir gives the example of the shoe shiner. So in 1950s, if Beauvoir had come to the United States, she may have observed someone saying that the black shoe shiner is just a shoe shiner. He is a shoe shiner. He is not a rational being. He's not a full human being. He's not capable of deep intellectual thought because he is a shoe shiner. That's just what he is. But there's a tension here. The fact that blacks were relegated to the margins of society, not to mention the lynchings and mass genocide, the fact that we put certain categories of people into certain roles where we only allow them access to certain activities and relationships in society is not a basis for saying that that's something essential about them. The fact that a black man in 1955 was a shoe shiner doesn't mean that he was essentially just a shoe shiner, any more than a woman is inherently just a woman. The otherizing is mystified. Here we go back to Bartkey's description of mystification again. Mystifying the actions, the events, the relations that other women, that other blacks, that other gays, that other lesbians, that other trans persons, that other intersex persons, that other persons with disabilities. This is a kind of becoming. It's not something that is inherent in certain persons. This is something that happens within a social milieu. There's a tension here. We play a role in our oppression because we internalize our otherness. It's part of our identity formation. On the other hand, we don't play a role in our tension because there are limitations and barriers that keep us from transcending the situation in which we find ourselves. So Beauvoir asks, should this state of affairs continue? What is it to be human? We need a conception of public good that assures the private good of the citizen. Saying you can't do some activity because you're a woman, or you can't do some activity because you're black, or you can't do some activity because you're disabled, doesn't work. Abstract equality does not work. Every subject strives for a mode of transcendence, to become more than the options they've been given. And people should be allowed to take part in activities that allow them to transcend, to engage in freely chosen projects, to be a subject, a self-constituting subject. So, for Beauvoir, the problem of women is a problem of liberty. It's a problem of freedom. There's a conflict between the self as essential and compulsions of a situation in which she is inessential. Reactionary measures are problematic, and we often look at women like they are not making their own choices due to the double bind. In the same way that we might have looked at the shoe shiner and perceived him as inferior, comes back to the fact that he did not have choices. His choices were limited. He was in a double bind because of racism in the US culture at that time. So the question might be whether or not we can both be a self and an other reciprocally in an environment in which othering is neutralized without hindering the possibilities of others, of other others, of other subjects. Here you have the introduction to the second sex, where Beauvoir is trying to make us see, help us to see that one is not born a woman, but rather one becomes a woman. There are a series of systematic actions, relations, otherings, which we internalize that go to the core of our very being, that we fail to adequately challenge, that keep us in a secondary, inferior, submissive role to men in this society. So on Beauvoir's view, gender oppression then requires women learning how to change their ontological reality, their ontological existence, to change who we are as subjects. Right? So we'll be thinking about this question quite a bit throughout this course. Who am I? What is it to be a subject? What is it to be a self? Well, Beauvoir's saying, well, if you're a woman in this society, what it is to be a self is not looking too great. There are limits in place preventing us from becoming the selves that we would choose to be. Our identities are not self-constituted. We are not capable of being the creative, transcendent beings that we would like to be. And over the course of the next several weeks, we'll talk about some of the particular reasons why that's the case. And we'll talk about what we might need to do to find a way to exercise our self-actualization, to exercise choices and decisions that we think would make us the kind of beings that we want to be. But we might wonder whether Beauvoir's solution is a good one. Basically, Beauvoir is saying, do you want out of gender oppression? Do you want to mitigate gender oppression? Then become a subject. Transcend your oppression. How does one just transcend their oppression if the oppression is coming from, to a large degree, from outside oneself? This continues to be a major tension in feminist theory, gender theory, disability theory, queer theory, trans studies. There's this tension about the interior and the exterior. How do I make my life better? How do I mitigate the kinds of oppressions that I suffer if those oppressions are not things that I personally have control of, if they're structural oppressions? So we'll be looking at some other ways of thinking about these kinds of questions. Please remember to post your questions about this piece, your comments about this piece, your observations about this piece on the discussion boards.